Hello, everyone. I'll be talking about investment for political gain, dyadic political relations, and Chinese outward direct investment. And this paper basically developed as a result of some research I did that looked at Chinese investment during the Eurozone crisis. And one of the things that we found, and something that we kind of keep coming back to in this discussion as well, is that there seems to be a lot of discussion around whether China invests in countries that will then give it something politically. Like Italy will give China, will become a Belt and Road country, and then, and in the same vein, China invests a lot of money there. One very well-known example as well was Greece in, I think, 2010, 2011, when Greece basically said in like big speeches, big statements in front of the European Union that it would support China's bid for the market economy status. It's kind of been forgotten now, but there seems to be this idea that there is a lot of reciprocity in Chinese investment. And I was really interested in seeing whether we can actually find that systematically or whether it's more on a case-by-case basis with different issues. So there is a little bit of a literature on this, but I haven't found any studies that looked exactly at this issue. The closest I found was by Fuchs and Klan that are looking at whether high-level visits with the Dalai Lama decrease a country's exports to China. So their argument, they basically find that yes, high-level visits do decrease the country's exports to China, and their argument is basically that Chinese people are nationalistic enough that they will not buy certain products based on, there's been a couple of boycotts and stuff like that, based on, for example, a German chancellor or a German foreign minister visiting with the Dalai Lama. This is their basic argument. They look at a couple of other political factors, and they found this very effectively for trade. There has been a lot of scholarship on whether political relations are linked to aid. And in the Chinese case, it can be difficult to distinguish between official development aid or development aid and outward direct investment. In the case of the US, Najavi, Aridi, and Ascari find that changes in political relations do not have an effect on capital flow from the US. But if we see such an effect, China would be the most likely case, because in China, the government has quite a direct impact on investment decisions of firms. Not only do firms have to be approved from a certain number, but the government also kind of suggests firms to invest somewhere. So there's a lot of more direct impact than it is, for example, in the US case. If we look at the literature on Chinese outward direct investment, we also find that there's a lot of mention of investments that are tied to political and strategic objectives, but there isn't actually a lot of study on what kind of political strategic objectives are tied there. And it's usually just mentioned as one thing the model can't explain. So that's kind of really where I wanted to go into and find out how could we maybe explain this? So my hypotheses are then that Chinese foreign direct investment or outward direct investment goes to countries that have more and stronger political ties with China. I will talk about how I operationalized this later on. Another hypothesis that I had was that Chinese outward direct investment to developing countries is more dependent on political goodwill than those flows to developed countries, because there's more outside options for developing countries. There's a lot more developing countries, and many times developing countries don't have the kind of technology that many Chinese companies are seeking. So we would expect that maybe Chinese outward direct investment would be more dependent on political goodwill, because China kind of has more power in this relationship if we go back to bargaining theory and game theory. And in a similar vein, we would also expect that investments to resource-rich countries are less guided by political concerns, because China needs oil, for example. And there's a couple of different countries that have oil, but it's not like China has the choice from 50 different countries that would be able to supply it the oil it needs. So my model then is basically a panel model that looks at the amount of investment flow in a country at a time and explains it using the political index and a couple of control variables. My data, I use China investment data from the China Statistical Yearbook. I also check for robustness with the stock data and also with an aggregated project level data set that I compiled myself from different sources. For my political variables, I basically constructed a new index from variables that are often mentioned in the literature. One is UN General Assembly resolution similarity in voting. It's the Hage dataset. The last update I found was from 2017. Hopefully they'll publish a new one soon. Dalai Lama visits to country I in year T, recognition of Taiwan, and computational event data from GDELT, which basically analyzes how media reports about a country, for example. So with this, we can kind of find out, is there a lot of negative press on China, which is one indicator for political. I condensed this index using a dimensionality reduction technique. And then I included a couple of control variables standard in the literature. So GDP per capita estimates, the rule of law index, resource intensity, inflation, and also trade as share of GDP. Just to give you an idea, the index that I end up with for political relations goes theoretically between -100 and +100, which is just for convenience. In practice, most of it is actually between -15 and +15. And we can see sort of a time trend for many of the countries that we look at. And I think for most of us, it might not be as surprising that some of these relations that we've talked about have gotten worse in recent years. So basically since 2013, 2014, we've had more tensions in many bilateral relations with China. Okay, what are my preliminary results? And this is very much work in progress, so if you have suggestions, comments, I would be very grateful. First, in the full panel, we have the expected signs, but we do have very low magnitudes, which isn't very surprising considering I am looking at the log of the investment flow data. This kind of confirms hypothesis 1, and I actually do have very high significance levels. I have the results later on if you want to see them in detail. For developing countries, the political index is significant, but the interaction between low income and political index is positive. But if we include lower middle income countries, then it becomes insignificant. This suggests that there's an S-shaped curve. So political relations are most significant for emerging countries and least developed countries, which might kind of make the point that we do have this idea of in relationships where China is feeling like a strong partner, so with least developed countries and emerging economies, it flexes its muscles a little more, whereas in relations where it feels a little less powerful, so to speak, it is less able to do so. Resource endowment doesn't seem to be important at all in the sample. There doesn't seem to be a difference between countries with a high level of resource intensity and countries without a high level of resource intensity. This is kind of a little puzzling to me, to be honest. Maybe some of you have some thoughts about this. So this paper basically states that good diplomatic ties or direct political agreement does lead to more FDI from China. It is trying to quantify the effect for developing and developed countries. And first of all, what this suggests is that in the future, whenever we study Chinese outward direct investment, we should include some sort of measures of political relations. what we should look at in the future is investments from other emerging economies, especially India. There has been some interesting research that looked at the trade issue with China and India in comparison. So doing this for the investment issue might be very interesting. So the project level database that I have currently should allow us to disaggregate this data into private versus state-owned investments as much as we can, of course, which would help us kind of make it more clear and possibly better. We would assume that state-owned investments are more politically guided than private investments. Then, of course, also brownfield versus greenfield. And I do have this big issue that the causality is not sufficiently answered in this study. It is reasonable to suggest that political relations become good because China invests in the country, or China invests in the country because political relations are good. It's very difficult to tease these two apart, and that's what I'm hoping to do in the future. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, any feedback, I'm here. Also, you can send me an email, add me on Twitter, whatever. Thank you.
I'll shoot the first question. You said that Chinese investment flows into developing countries is very much dependent on political goodwill. What do you mean by that?
Okay, well, political goodwill is just one of the terms I used for this political index. So because it's comprised of basically how good is the media reporting about China, like how positively, how much are these countries agreeing with China on important UN General Assembly votes, how often do these countries go against what China considers its core interests. So do they have the Dalai Lama visit? Do they acknowledge Taiwan as a country?
I personally think that all that you said just constitutes a very small fraction of the reason why China goes into less developed countries like African countries. I don't know, you were not at my presentation. And China has an agenda with most African countries. And I don't think political goodwill per se is the main reason why it goes into less developed countries like African countries. There's a lot more to that.
I'm not stating that political goodwill is the main reason. I'm stating that, or what I'm basically trying to find out is when China has sort of the choice between different countries, which it often does, then this might be the deciding factor. Like it could invest in two countries that are similar in many respects.
It could be a complementary factor, but not the main one, of course.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I actually enjoyed your paper. Just suggestions, I don't have a question. It seems that China's kind of response, being a Canadian, I'm now experiencing, I know that my country experiences it. And I've seen evidence that China punished Norway because it awarded the peace, not the peace prize, it was a peace prize to a dissident. No, it was Nobel Prize.
Nobel Prize, yeah.
So it would be kind of, I don't know, it's a separate paper, but it's in the same way to look at kind of specific, identify some specific things, and doing almost like event study, but it's not event study, It basically do like case studies to kind of support. And it may very well be that it would be interesting, for example, if China became more nuanced about punishing, like Canada, we always believed that we had this guy Butane, and he was a doctor very loved by the Chinese, and therefore our relationship was great and goodwill. Yeah. Anyway, the point is that didn't help Canada. Recently, we arrested the wrong person.
Yeah.
So but I think it would be really interesting to maybe there is punishment, persistent kind of punishment. I don't want to do business with you, which I think you are discovering. Okay, I will do less business in a persistent kind of way, but it would be kind of looking to look at specific events, and there are quite a few examples, and see, for example, how the punishment changes, etc. So, it's just a suggestion for future work.
Oh, actually, not really in terms of punishment. I was saying in terms of the Chinese concept of losing face.
Perhaps. Except in this case, Canada is losing the face and the business.
Thank you. I enjoyed the paper, and I just wanted to follow on with the suggestion about some case studies. I mean, one that comes to my mind is Hungary, because I'm living there at the moment, and the narrative in the European Union about Hungary's relationship is that Hungary, since Viktor Orban was elected, Viktor Orban's a Trump-like populist liberal leader in Hungary, and he has developed this very close relationship with China. So he signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, first country in Europe, and set up this 16+1 initiative and all kinds of initiatives between China and Hungary. And Hungary, in terms of the long-term FDI stock, is the #1 destination for Chinese investment in Central and Eastern Europe. So the narrative in the European Union is that, well, Hungary is captive of China and has built this political relationship, and that's why they have all this trade investment. Whereas actually, if you look at over time, if you look at where the trade investment happened, the big acquisitions were actually before Orban was elected, and the trade was actually much stronger when there was a competitive complementarity between the two economies. In fact, after Orban was elected, the trade investment has actually decreased. But what has changed is that Orban has supported China on a couple of issues about non-interference in Chinese issues, and you know, it could be argued, if you look at it as a case study, that his reason for doing that is not at all Chinese influence, but rather he wants to send that message to the European Union that countries shouldn't be interfered with within their borders. So it's one of those many diversity of case studies around the world where actually there's often a lot more going on, and so maybe it would really to pull out a few case studies and to actually assess your data against some of the politics and other issues going on is very interesting.